Good. Ready to go, Sam?
Okay, awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Sam Quigley Smith. I'm the head women's basketball coach at SIUE just outside of St. Louis, and I'm also on the board for Play Smart Save Lives. Welcome to the Play Smart Save Lives Zoom panel on starting a conversation. Start talking to your students about guns and violence. June 6th today is also National Gun Violence Awareness Day, so it's very appropriate that we're meeting today. Well, it's really great and reassuring to see all your faces on this screen. Obviously, this is a very sensitive topic, but also one that needs to be discussed. The attendance shows how important this topic is and how we are all eager to see change. Almost every team in college basketball has been touched by gun violence. I myself, as a student athlete at DePaul University, had a teammate and a really close friend whose brother was shot and killed in Michigan. She was heartbroken, distraught, and ended up quitting the team. With the many caring people and individuals at DePaul, she asked to rejoin our program a year later and was eventually named Big East Sixth Woman of the Year. Helping her through that trying time certainly spoke to the resources and aid much of our youth needs. But still, it's a really helpless feeling. She wasn't just a teammate, she was my friend and someone I consider family even to this day. So moving to what Play Smart Save Lives does. Play Smart is an advocacy organization comprised of coaches, players, politicians, nonprofit organizations, and businesses focused on ending gun violence. It is our mission to educate, engage, and change the ways guns are stored in homes. We offer resources to help coaches, players, alums, and all those who care to prevent gun tragedies and heal teams and communities in the aftermath of loss. Today, we'll hear from some great panelists, many of whom I'm sure you're familiar with. Rob Wilcox will be our moderator, former Deputy Director of the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. We will ask if you have any questions and highly encourage questions to put them in the chat. And Rob, you could take it away.
Thanks, Coach. I'm Rob Wilcox. Really excited to be here with you on behalf of Play Smart. I did serve in the White House as one of the founding deputy directors of the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. But the truth is, like folks on this call, I didn't come to this work through choice or with ambition. It was growing up in Brooklyn, New York, between a couple housing projects and having a family member who was shot and killed. And like the rest of you, you never forget that pain, but for most of us, it gives us real purpose. And so I wanted to start this panel and get you to these incredible folks that we have to share with you. But I really want to kind of open with kind of two big thoughts. One is, we've come to a place in our country where firearms are the leading cause of death for children and teens. And, just let that sink in, right? We think a lot about pediatric cancer. We think a lot about car accidents and car seats. We think a lot about healthy food and choices, but it's firearms that are the leading cause of death. And that is everyday violence that happens in our communities. That's probably about 2/3 of it. About another third is suicide. Young people who harm themselves, right, from bouts of depression, moments of crisis. And then we obviously have violence that can happen in schools as well, which makes up a small but terribly impactful piece of this crisis. The second thing I want to open us with is, in the midst of that pain and that tragedy, we have real solutions. And the panelists we have, Coach Smith, Dr. Tillmon, Arne Duncan, Greg Jackson, will talk to us about some of those solutions. But I just want to let you know that I've seen them at work firsthand at the national level. And what we've seen the past 2 years is nothing short of historic. The biggest reduction in gun violence in our nation's history in 2023, about 13% across the country, only to be surpassed in 2024 with nearly a 16% reduction. And that's hard work that goes into it, but it's hard work that can make real results and make a real difference. I was just talking to some officials in Baltimore, and what they told me is, in the month of April, they had 5 homicides in the entire city. That is the lowest number of homicides ever recorded in history. And these are not just data points. These are hard-won victories of reductions that come from folks in the ground on community in partnership with health systems, academics, coaches, schools, local and state government. And so I am so excited to moderate this panel and dig in, because I think the solutions that we need are just right in front of us. And in rooms like this, we can educate each other, we can share, we can figure out the problems we need to solve, but we can also share solutions. And we can figure out how we can be doing better to heal that trauma. And Coach, you laid it out perfectly. That trauma that can just take someone completely off the rails, but also to intervene and prevent that violence in the future. So I want to open it up with someone who I never thought I'd be able to share a stage with, but the 3-time National Coach of the Year, individual who coached Kentucky to a national championship, also started his own foundation, Coach Tubby Smith. And as I was preparing for this, Coach, I saw your quote where you said there's nothing more important than having this conversation. And I was just hoping you could expand on why you think that is. It's so important that we have this conversation, and what really brought you to that place in your mind that this is the topic that we have to focus on now.
Well, good morning, and it's good to be a part of this. I'm certainly glad that Coach Cottrell invited me to be a part of this, and certainly Rob, and I appreciate what you've done, and certainly sympathize with the loss you had in your family. But guns, I was very blessed to grow up in a household with 16 other siblings. And I was, guns have been a part of my youth. But my dad was an ex-World War II veteran, wounded in 1943, was in infantry in Sicily. And he taught us that firearms, they're weapons. And that's what they used for. We used to go hunting, and we were deer hunting, rabbit hunting, whatever we were hunting for. But he taught us how. So, but being a college basketball coach and a high school coach, former coaches, I'm retired now, I can appreciate, because I've had relatives. 2 of my nephews, well, one was stabbed and one was shot to death. So I have a real, and to lose someone, and I've always wondered why, because people are just not educated. I want to help educate young people, especially about not just the dangers, but the what these weapons and what guns will do, and how they can destroy many lives.
Thank you, Coach. I want to bring in another panelist, Arne Duncan, another hooper who played through college and internationally, but also CEO of Chicago Public Schools, became the 9th Secretary of Education in the United States. And I think maybe the biggest legacy is the founder of Chicago Cred, which is an incredibly important effort in the city of Chicago to give economic opportunity and resources, and someone who we had the pleasure of meeting with at the White House when he brought his entire team to share with us the work they were doing. And so, Arne, I was hoping you could share with the group kind of how you came to this issue, how you approach it, in that intersection of youth and sports and prevention.
Thanks so much for having me, and unfortunately you caught us on a bad day. You may have seen we had a female police officer here killed last night. Her little daughter's birthday's tomorrow, and every gun death is tragic, but this one's hitting particularly hard. So a lot going on right now. Unfortunately, I guess like you and others, coming to work is maybe not a choice, but comes from a place of pain. Losing friends when I was growing up playing on the South and West sides, and we talked about when I led Chicago Public Schools. Lots I'm proud of. I can talk about successes another call if folks are interested, but on my watch, in my 7.5 years, on average, we had a public school student killed every 2 weeks due to gun violence. It was just a devastating rate of loss. And coming back home to Chicago from DC, this felt like the crisis facing the city. Felt like none of us had done enough to keep our kids safe on the South and West side. So we've been at this work for 8.5 years now, which is sort of crazy. And I would say it's the hardest thing I've ever done, the most heartbreaking, honestly, but also the most inspiring, and hopefully the most meaningful over time. And we're seeing dramatic reductions in violence across the city in our neighborhoods past couple of years. So we're going the right way despite the real tragedy last night. Just a couple thoughts. And again, these, you guys are coaches. This is your world. As you're recruiting players, anywhere, but specifically from the inner city, it's probably hard to recruit a player whose life hasn't been touched by gun violence. That's just unfortunately the reality in urban America today. And, no amount of NIL money or anything can sort of, hide those facts. And so really addressing that trauma and really talking to your players about their lived experience is critically important. And, you guys are expert teachers and communicators. It can be hard to get, young men and young women to open up and to be vulnerable, but helping young people heal from trauma, that's like at the heart of our work here at Chicago Cred. And it's not easy, it's not overnight, it's not linear, but it's the most important thing we do. Secondly, the combination of social media and guns is just literally a lethal combination. And young people, generally young athletes, I think often feel invincible, and just really trying to educate them about what they're putting on social media. Does the whole world have to know everywhere they are every minute of the day? If you're in situations that don't make sense, getting out, not broadcasting your whereabouts. They're just some real basic things that I think coaches can help to do. Third is, on top of healing from trauma, just teaching de-escalation skills is again just absolutely critical to what we do. And we were saying that hurt people, but people that are healing can heal themselves and heal their families and heal the community. And for me, the great fear in all this is that folks who are dealing with trauma, if they are triggered, things can escalate and go south, in a hurry. We just had I can barely describe it. We had a horrific tragedy here about, a week and a half ago, where we ended up having 2 people killed in one of the neighborhoods where we work. We knew one of the men, literally over a piece of cheese on a sandwich at the sandwich shop. And because it wasn't the right kind of cheese, there became an altercation between the person behind the counter, customer and the person behind the counter. The woman behind the counter calls her son has a gun, everything's out of control, and we have 2 people dead literally over a piece of cheese. And so teaching your young men and women how to de-escalate, how to walk away from situations, how not to take everything to the extreme, not to have their manhood, their womanhood, at so fragile, so threatened, is really important. And the final point I'll make is really interesting. Just recently, the Bulls coaches, a few of them have been coming over to watch our work at Cred, and they're just they have young players who are about pro players about the same age as most of your college players these days. They're all the same. They're really trying to figure out how best to communicate. Again, you guys are all teachers, you're all communicators with young people today. Is it written? Is it verbal? Is it video? Is it small group? Is it individual? How can you take instruction? How can you take criticism, critique, frankly? And so just thinking about those things of how to best impart the knowledge and the wisdom and hopefully the life-saving skills that you're giving to your young people, how you think about that, how you do that is different. Every generation is different, but it's just interesting how intentional the Bulls coaches now are trying to figure out how to better communicate to the young players coming in. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Arne. I think you've raised, and Coach Smith started us by raising that important intersection of firearm and the cultural relevance that firearms have played in lots of our lives. My dad was in the Green Beret, and so we grew up with firearms. But then we also, I think, Arne, you really touched on that everyday pain that's happening. And when I speak to solutions, and we're going to move to Dr. Tillmon, who's a real legend in this field, it's not to ignore that pain. I think you laid it out perfectly. It's the everyday pain we feel, and it's the trauma that has a tail through lives. And so I want to bring into this conversation Dr. Chico Tillmon, the Executive Director of the Community Violence Intervention Leadership Academy at the University of Chicago Crime Lab, also a PhD in criminology, one of the leading thinkers in this country on not just what are the solutions, but how do we train and get people in the game of putting the solutions in place. And I'm hoping, Dr. Tillmon, you could you could build a little bit on how you think about the solutions and how do we give people the tools, because this is a call that has college coaches that might not be as familiar with the programs that you're working on and the people you're working with who are doing this work in the community. And so if you could lift up kind of what you see across the country when it comes to the solutions to this pain, but also how do we recover from this trauma?
I want to pivot and do something a little different. Rob, there's connectivity to the question you asked, but I would like to give a charge to the coaches. First up, I'm an individual from the west side of Chicago, born and raised, been involved in subculture groups, but also the one bright part of my life is I played basketball in grammar school and high school prior to going to the military. And the most influential male that's ever been in my life was my coach at Steinmetz High School. That's the person that I listened to that could talk to me when I was thinking about doing things that were irrational, because I love the game of basketball. And he taught me the game of basketball teaches you things about life. It's bigger than what goes on the court. When you coach in teams, you teach them about integrity, about honesty. And sometimes even when you discipline players, it's for things that have nothing to do with X's and O's. Or when you don't play players, it has something that deals with nothing about X's and O's. And I want to say something else. Athletes and entertainers are the biggest influence in minority communities, because many of us have seen that as, in some cases, the only pathway to success, because typically in vulnerable communities, individuals who achieve any type of employment typically move out. So that's the challenge in inner cities, is that unlike other ethnic communities, typically if a person get a decent job, the first thing they do is move their family out. So you surrounded by this socioeconomic challenge, and also the other social determinants of health. But individuals in sports are big influences, and it breaks my heart when individuals that play sports say, I'm not called on to be a role model, because people in the community gonna emulate you because they look up to you. I wish we encourage them to be a role model. And also, athletes have the power to shift cultural norms, because the star athlete, and when I say a star, a high school star, the person at the college, they could determine what's cool. And I think we got to start determining that it's not cool to interact in a violent manner. Like, that's not cool. The same way, if you think about maybe, and I'm going to date myself, 20 years ago, you might see a coach smoking in his office. Now, if you even think about lighting a cigarette or a cigar on campus, everybody gonna be alarmed. So we can shift what's cool. And Arne brought up something perfect about social media. We could start utilizing those platforms to say, like, it's not cool to respond to negative stuff that can lead to this, and that, and start really doing it in a way, not so much advertising, but modeling certain behaviors where that's not cool. Because really what we've seen also is people throw away their entire career based upon the pressures in the community to respond a specific way. Now, this is what I want to say. One of the things about growing up in the city that we have to deconstruct is we are taught, which is foolish, that your name means everything. So disrespect in our community means, if you disrespect me or say something to me negatively, means I have to respond with equal amount of force or worse, just to prove that I am who I am, to protect my name, which is foolishness. You know, when you think about throwing away your life just because somebody criticized you. And I think we got to disrupt those negative cultural norms that people have in these communities so that it won't erupt into violence. And we got to make having conversations more popular, or having discourse about challenges more popular than resulting in using violence to resolve things. We got to make it cool to have a conversation with the people and open up forums to discuss challenges as opposed to acting violently when challenges jump off. And I think this is a great platform to start pushing that narrative, even to people on your team. Like, no, we don't do that. That's not how we conduct ourselves. And I believe that could trickle down into other spaces, because I believe the influence of athletes is larger than what they believe, and people are watching them and look up to them, and their voice matters. And I think we got to continue to remind them of the importance of their voice and their actions, so that they don't continue to almost like amplify violence like some athletes have, as opposed to, given the mindset that it's not cool to act in that particular way. And I would love if you start encouraging athletes like, this is how you handle situations, so we could see that being built out in other communities.
Thank you, Dr. Tillmon. I think that actually perfectly encaptured why we're here, is kind of thinking about the very specific cultural issues and what we're all drawn to with athletics and sports. I mean, I feel the same way. The biggest influence in my young life was my high school football coach, my college lacrosse coach. And, that was one of the biggest differences in my life was getting the chance to play sports. And then how important those moments are to not just shape kind of what's happening with that team and inside that locker room, but what it looks like outside of the locker room, which is where I really appreciated you going. And I want to bring in our fourth panelist, and a good friend of mine, also a well-accomplished high school athlete like myself, Greg Jackson, who was my co-deputy director at the White House, but in all seriousness is one of the true national leaders in this space and pushing policy and pushing solutions. I saw him do things at the White House that people said were impossible, including building the first ever gun violence emergency response system. The president challenged him and said, we have FEMA for hurricanes, but we are not showing up with that same level of intensity when there are increases in community violence, or 20 people shot at a barbecue, or incident of mass violence. And I saw Greg pull together federal agencies and really build the first ever historic gun violence emergency response system. And so, as someone who is a national leader and has been in this work for a while, I was hoping you could just situate us in your journey a little, but also kind of what do you see nationally, and how important do you think the kind of college coaches are, and that kind of environment to the solutions for gun violence?
Well, thank you, Rob, and thanks to the Play Smart community. And as Rob shared, I am a high school great. My dad, mom and dad played basketball. My mom actually played in college at North Carolina A&T, so she was the better of the two. But you couldn't tell my dad that. So I grew up as I think I picked up a basketball when I was 3 years old, and battled it out with my family almost every day. We still do, actually. So it just means a lot to be in this space. And frankly, so much of who I am was formed in the locker rooms and that practice and in those background battles. And so when we think about the issue of gun violence, this is something that I came to not by choice or ambition, but by accident and really by circumstance when I got caught in the crossfire in April of 2013. And the bullet that hit me hit two arteries and left me bedridden for 6 months. And I'll never forget that feeling of not knowing if I was going to walk again, not knowing if I was going to be able to play sports again, or even to just get back to some form of normalcy. And that was probably the hardest moment of my life. And I think with this issue of gun violence, we too often forget about the folks who are traumatized, and we forget that trauma ripples, and that pain and frustration, and a lot of times anger, sits with people for a long time, and can later fuel into future acts of violence. And thankfully, I had a great surgeon, 6 months of recovery, 6 different surgeries, great therapeutic team, and now I can play again. I'm more of a set shooter now. I lost my slashing moves, but I still shoot the lights out, But I'm so thankful for that team. But that was so big to me. And when we think about the issue of gun violence, that's what led me into the movement. But a lot of what we focused on is making sure that those who are traumatized get the resources and support they need to heal and recover. Because right now, violence in our country, it looks very different. It's not as simple as, gang activity or drug activity or illegal activity. In fact, only 21% of gun-related deaths in the Black community are even connected to another felony. And only 11% are connected to any form of gang activity. And what we're seeing really raging across our country is community violence, interpersonal conflict between people who know each other. And it's typically over pettier disputes, whether it's a argument in a party, a girl they used to date, what someone said to me, what someone said over there, or what they did to my cousin. But when you really dig a little deeper, we quickly learn is that trauma that kind of creates that explosive moment and that has been untreated, and that folks are already kind of on the edge of their seat. And that's just really what pushes them over. And so nationally, that's been a huge focus, is how do we provide more resources and support to help people in those moments of crisis, but also to provide more tools to help de-escalate. And a couple key things I'm just really proud of. One, we moved over $42 billion in the violence prevention programs and efforts. And two big highlights. One was adding resources for school-based mental health professionals. And we actually funded the training and hiring of 14,000 school-based mental health professionals. And many of those folks who were trained are coaches, right? They're not just, someone who's a social worker, but these are people who already are integrated and engaged with our youth. And I think that's powerful, because for me, it was Coach Charles Rogers, God rest his soul. He was my assistant coach, and he was that one that pulled us aside and always made sure if we're having a tough day that we learn how to navigate through it emotionally before we take the court. And we think that type of approach is really powerful. How do we make sure that everyone who already has touch points in our communities have more resources to help de-escalate, to provide that crisis support? But we also know that there are organizations like Chicago Cred and so many others that are specializing in working with those who are most at risk, those who have been shot, those who have been the shooters, or those who are 1 degree of separation. And while it may seem like a strong line between the classroom and the community on paper, to our youth in our country, it's a very thin line. The same kids they argue with and battle with in the classroom are the same ones they see in the neighborhood. And a big effort of ours was how do we strengthen and invest and resource those efforts across the country. And frankly, between investing in violence prevention efforts, pushing real policy and regulation to reduce the access to firearms, and then helping people heal and recover, those were like the 3 major pillars of our work at the White House. And I'm it's a tough time right now because a lot of that is under siege. But I'm so proud that we did that because it showed real results. Across the country, we saw a 31% reduction in homicides. And the average reduction for a city with over 1 million residents was 40%. And I know Rob shared some of those highlights earlier, but we are seeing historic drops in homicides across the country. And the steepest drops are happening amongst young men and young women in our inner cities. And so I think it's a real testament that this approach works, that if we invest in prevention, that we work to keep guns out of the hands of those, that moment of crisis, and we help people heal, that we can literally save lives. And similar to Dr. Chico, I do want to share a challenge that's not something that only politics can do. That's something that every coach and every program can play a part in. What community groups are you partnered with? What Chicago Creds or Life Camps or Safe Streets Baltimore do you have a relationship with? And how can you all connect and support each other in your mission? What work are you doing around educating our young folks about the risk of firearm ownership and how to safely store their guns, as Coach Smith talked about, like giving them that responsible ownership lessons that, frankly, they don't get in the community unless someone teaches them. But then 3, how do we make sure we're helping people heal after an act of trauma? And it doesn't have to be just, losing a teammate. It could be losing an uncle, a cousin, a father, and really you can play a huge role in supporting them, which I know you already are doing. But also making sure they get that professional support and that they can heal the way that they need. And I'll just share one last thing. When I was recovering, I fell into a really deep depression, really deep. And it was full of anger and rage. And until I met someone who was another survivor, that was so key to me, because he shared that you will never be the same person you were before. But it doesn't mean you have to be a worse version of yourself. And that ability to let go of the past and start building a new future was a huge turning point for me. And I think so many of the players and students that you're working with, they're dealing with trauma, they're dealing with loss and these very intense events. And a lot of them just need that professional support and that guidance that, hey, you can build a better version, even if it's not in sports or on the court. And so I know that was huge for me, and hopefully that's something you can share and carry on in your space. So I'll pass it back to Rob. I'm sure there's some more questions for us, but excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. That was amazing, and thank you for sharing that story about that critical moment about how do you move forward. I think, Sam, Coach, spoke to that at the very top as well. It's, once you've experienced that trauma, it's how do we help people not live the life of their past, but of the future. And that's going to take healing, and it's going to take positivity. And so, Coach Smith, I wanted to come back to you, and you've kind of seen, young student athletes, many, many years, many different evolutions of culture during that time, with social media, with the availability of firearms. And I was hoping you could kind of share with us kind of some key experiences you've had of how you've helped young athletes through these kind of traumatic moments, and kind of how you've thought through the role that you could play as a coach when some of your student athletes experience gun violence.
Well, and there's some great stuff, and I think those coaches or those folks that are on the line on the webinar are learning a lot about what goes in, and the people that are exposed, and how important or how involved or how engaged people are in helping others. And I think that's where it comes from. And then we touched on it before about respect. Respect what these weapons can do. I think for most people, and especially kids, I remember growing up watching TV and, the violence, you could see it coming. And so now you try to control. I grew up in a household with 16 other siblings, 12 girls and 5 boys. And so you didn't have access to the digital and the phones. And so it was, but this violence, gun violence, I look back at just as a coach teaching players how to de-escalate, even on a basketball court, that you train them to play with emotion, but not be emotional. And I think in controlling your behavior, and the other thing is just surrounding yourself with people that are going to be looking out for you, that are going to help you become a better person. I think that's huge. Many can't change their neighborhood, but there are many that can just associate, especially, I grew up in the country, in a small town in Southern Maryland. So you didn't have gangs and that you have and things that are going on into today's society. But I think one of the things is just, we used to have a rule, fellas, nothing good. My dad used to tell me, well, nothing good happens after 12 o'clock at night. He said, you might as well get your butt home. And so I think it's recognizing and anticipating. And that's something he taught me. But when you're I can tell you not to do this, but you're probably going to try it anyway. But be able to always have an exit. And, he was wounded in World War II. And I said, Dad, were you scared? He said, boy, you had to learn. So, yeah, I was scared. So I think the fear factor is something that when people heard Greg Jackson talking about how your name, the people think they're being disrespected or by someone saying something or doing something. So I think in athletics, a lot of that is part of life. That's what happens on a basketball court, or what happens on a football field, or a lacrosse field, or volleyball. I mean, that intensity that you play with, now you have to learn to control it. I think if we can keep teaching people how to control their emotions, and again, de-escalating issues that come up, and then exiting, getting out of that situation. There's nothing wrong with not necessarily running away, but getting away from that. So I know in these days today we're trying to train people how to handle all types of situations, whether it's single shooters. I've got grandkids now in school, and I asked them a lot about. Well, I don't ask them a lot, but they do drills now. It used to be just a fire drill, or a tornado drill, or air raid back during. Now it's, if someone has a gun, how do we protect each other and how do we protect ourselves? So I think, in my opinion, it's just the respect that you have to have for what damage. And I think that's where, when I look back at growing up, even when you were hunting, you could see the damage that a shot would do to a bird or to an animal. And so there's no way you would ever want to point a gun at someone. And that's what my dad taught us. A weapon, and it's to be used in that way, and never. I just think it's this is so critical. What we're doing here, the Play Smart Forum, that saves lives. So this is gun violence month, so it's important that we educate coaches so they can educate their players. I think one of the things that you have to do more of is have more dialogue, more conversation. And then you have to have places and spaces where people can go, where they can feel safe, where kids can be safe, whether it's the YMCA, Boys and Girls Clubs, opening up schools at night for young people to participate. And then they can learn, and you can teach them how to respond when was a hard foul, and don't jump up and start fighting and respond that way. It's just, it's so critical. So there are certain things that as a coach you wouldn't allow and you wouldn't tolerate. And even when you're in the heat of battle, you got to be able to control your emotions and control your attitude.
Thank you, Coach. I want to build off that kind of point you emphasized a few times around de-escalation. And Dr. Tillmon, I want to come back to you, and I know if you can kind of share with us the strategies around de-escalation, some of the ways that you've seen that be effective in intervening and preventing violence, because I think we got to give people the encouragement to be in these spaces, but also the tools. And I know you've thought a lot about that, of kind of what are the tools that we need to be equipped with to be really effective in the space. If you don't come off mute, I'm just going to move on, Dr. Tillmon.
I'm sorry. Another thing I want to do is thank Play Smart for even bringing this convening together for during Violence Prevention Month and Awareness Day. But also I got to give some flowers to Arne. I was wondering, I remember when we first met, when he first started CRED, oftentimes in our community, we've been made so many promises about people really digging in deep and having impact and changing lives. And I really want to thank you publicly for all the work you've done in Chicago, not just starting Chicago CRED, but saving hundreds and thousands of lives across the city and impacting and hearing the testimonies of people. I think one of the things we could do is take a person or organization like CRED and bring classes around de-escalation, or license to operate, use people that's credible or will have influence to start teaching classes around de-escalation in health class. Start showing individuals the result of individuals being injured by a firearm, helping parents understand how to take somebody from outburst down to baseline. I'll tell you this, right? In many cases, individuals not always are armed, but they typically are with somebody who you would say has a level head, but they don't have the tools to be able to de-escalate a situation. Because what we've learned from gun violence is that less than 1% of the population drives gun violence. So that means 99% of the people aren't even involved in the violence that we have in our country. So if they knew how to bring a person from outburst back down the baseline, and I'll give you an example real quick. Even when I was doing crazy stuff and in the street, my mom would just yell at me, not understanding that when a person is upset, yelling at them, they can't even comprehend that while they're at outbursts. You got to calm them down so that they can actually listen to what you're saying to really comprehend that you're trying to get them another strategy in order to resolve the conflict. Because when you think about it, violence is just a tool to decide to resolve a situation, and people think that's their only result. That's all violence is. It's a situation. This situation is going a particular way, and I think the best way to solve this is by getting a gun or by getting a weapon, because then I believe in my mind that the problem goes away. So what we got to teach people is non-aggressive ways to resolve conflict. And I think one way we could do it is by expanding the knowledge and teaching coaches, teaching players, teaching parents and people in the community not how to mediate gun violence, but how to de-escalate situations with individuals that's close to them, how to calm people down so that we don't have those road rage incidents, so that we don't have those incidents where it's an argument in the grocery store and it results in somebody being shot. But I don't think, unless we bring people like CRED and other organizations who have professionalized this into these public spaces and begin to teach people different ways to do it, that it won't be able to expand exponentially as quick as we need it to. So we need to bring experts in, and I think it needs to be tied to a class, and people have to become aware of the impact of gun violence. I think in our communities, what has happened is we done normalized this so much where we say, if you think about the news, it might say 6 people shot in this particular community, and they just jump through it like nothing happened if it's in a community that it happens often. Only time it's played over and over again, not just mass shootings, when somebody is shot that they feel shouldn't be shot. But what we're saying is anybody shot is valuable. And I think we got to normalize that behavior, but also we got to begin to teach common people or lay people how to de-escalate situations and continue to promote non-aggressive resolutions.
I want to kind of give you your flowers too, because the thing is you've been training leaders across the country. And I think there's another challenge to lay down, which is that in just about every community in this country, we have experts on the ground who are doing this work. Experts who are from the community with lived experience, who've thought through, as you said, that how do we professionalize the work? And so that is a challenge for all of us, is that if you were looking to engage in this work as a coach, you will have a partner, I'd imagine it's fair to say, Dr. Tillmon, on the ground who can really partner with you to talk about the strategies that are being deployed in the community. You also kind of talked about, I think, very powerfully about that trauma that is being experienced. 1% of folks might be pulling the trigger, but the U.S. Surgeon General told us about half of Americans have been exposed to gun violence one way or the other. So it's a small number of people who might pull the trigger, but it's a lot of us who are feeling that trauma. And I think there's a point in what you said that's so critical. It's like we might not have a mental health diagnosis for exposure to violence, but we got to treat it like a mental health crisis, because we know that impact is so severe. And so, Arne, I want to come back to you, ask a question. I got a final question for Greg on safe storage and some of the work we did there, because I want to make sure that it's a Play Smart priority. But and you mentioned this, heal people. How have you thought about that kind of the issue that I think Dr. Tillmon raised, that I just kind of touched on, which is this might not be a full-on mental health diagnosis, but that healing work and that trauma recovery, kind of how have you built the program to really lean into that? Because as you laid out, the kids in the Chicago schools are experiencing it, the folks you work with through CRED. And so how have you developed real program and strategies around trauma recovery?
Well, we make a lot of mistakes every day, and we're learning every day. But we started with one clinician on our team, now 22, and again, healing from trauma has got to be the heart of our work. And I'll just say this: I keep looking for a great AI solution. I just don't think there is one. And I just think relationships change lives. And I look at people on this call, people like Craig Robinson, Isaac Carter, people I had growing up to, look up to, and near peers who steered me in the right direction. And Chico and I were at an event the other day with another sports group, the Chicago Sports Alliance, of the pro teams here who are helping to fund some of our collective work. And one of the young men who spoke, who came from the streets, served a lot of time, came out. He said something incredibly profound, I thought. He said, we must become the immune system to violence. And I think coaches and players are uniquely positioned to be part of that immune system. You guys did an amazing job, you and Greg and your team in the White House. Those days are gone. I mean, that's over. The help ain't coming. The cavalry ain't coming. And so we all got to help each other. But coaches and players becoming that immune system to violence, helping teach the good habits. We can help, train or whatever that might be. But coaches and players, as Chico talked about, are just in a unique position as influencers to help reach the kids who need help. And what's the craziest thing in all this stuff, most of these incidents of violence, it happens in like a minute or 90 seconds or 2 minutes. It happens so fast. And so you have to give people the tools to think very differently in that moment. It can't be, the day after, it's too late. The tragedy's already happened. And so you guys as coaches are master relationship builders. And, gun violence is a lot like COVID. It travels through social networks, and we got to intervene there. But if coaches can think, you got a lot of other responsibilities, including winning games on your plate. But if coaches can think of yourselves as those that help to become the immune system to violence and build those webs, build those networks, anything we can try to do to be helpful, I would be more than happy to try and do that.
Thank you, Arne, and I appreciate the compliment. The truth is the White House was never a destination for me and Greg. It was a vehicle. It was a vehicle to advance this work, accelerate this work, and he name-checked some of that progress. And the truth is, you're right. We don't have that anymore, but we have plenty of vehicles. And our job in this call and other spaces is to identify them and then drive them as hard as possible. And that could be state government, local government, it could be coaches and teams, it could be health systems, hospitals, schools. But we know the solutions in the playbook. We just got to find those vehicles. And then I think we learned that at the White House, what it looks like at scale, but that doesn't mean the work obviously stops. And Greg, I want to end with you both I know, with PlaySmart, one of the big priorities is kind of safe storage. And we kind of took a different approach at the White House when we thought about it. And I was hoping you could kind of share kind of how you think about safe storage, because, and I'll say this, one of the things PlaySmart made me aware of is with the NIL money, there's a real thing going on with people getting NIL dollars and buying firearms. And that puts coaches potentially in a position of how do we advise on gun ownership and gun possession. And so I was hoping you could bring into this conversation how you think about safe gun storage, how important you think it is as part of these solutions, because we've talked about intervention and trauma healing, but how do we think about, that piece as well?
Yeah. A lot of what we talked about was how we shift behaviors before someone picks up the gun. But it's also really important to ask yourself, how did they get the gun? And when we looked at youth violence specifically, we really found a few sources of how our youth are getting guns. And believe it or not, the number one source was not a boogeyman in a white van in an alley. But the number one source for our young folks getting guns are out of their own homes. They're coming out of nightstands and closets and basements, which tells us a lot. It tells us a lot about what's happening and how unresponsible even folks who think they're responsible are in their firearms and firearm storage. Just a couple important stats for you to know. 76% of school shootings, the guns have come from the home. 80% of youth suicides, the guns have come from the home. And I believe 74% of accidental deaths, the guns come from the home. We've also found that when you think about guns that show up illegally on crime scenes, a great deal of them are stolen firearms, and they're typically stolen from unsecured homes and unsecured cars. And so we know that, look, if we want to slow down the source of guns that they're showing up in our schools or even causing harm to our youth, one of the biggest things we can do is just be better about locking them up. Better about making sure that parents know that, hey, you're trying to protect your family, or this is what you use for hunting. Well, guess what? It can be used to cause just as much damage in your home or in our schools and in our communities. And so that was a big thing that we pushed. We partnered with the Department of Education. We've been challenging school systems to start to educate parents about this. We've also been challenging hospitals to start to engage, their patients, right, about the education around safe storage, recognizing that unsecured guns are causing a great deal of damage. We also found that, look, the way people learn about responsible gun ownership is really two sources. It's law enforcement or their family. And if you're coming from a community that, like Coach Smith, that's rural, that hunt rabbits and all of that, a lot of that is ingrained very deep into their family traditions and just a way of life. But new gun owners don't have that same access of education and engagement. And unless they're willing to go to law enforcement, to go through a shooting range or training class, we know that just the basic education around safe storage and responsible ownership is just lacking and not as accessible to everyone. But you as coaches, y'all have a great deal of access. You already know these players. Hey, you already shared, hey, they're buying guns, they're protecting themselves, they're doing it for hunting or recreation. But that education is something that's missing and not easily accessible. And that's a very small thing you can do with all parents, with all players, recognizing that right now, there are over 400 million guns in America. And so what we did, frankly, at the White House, is we thought about, okay, each government agency can play a role in engaging different audiences. We know that Department of Housing can connect with communities that are on housing assistance. The Department of Agriculture can help us get deeper into rural communities. The Department of Health can help us get to patients, and education can help us get into schools. And I think you all have a very unique touch point, and I challenge you to do the same, in your space, but also challenge your peers, challenge your principals, your superintendents. Like, look, this is a huge problem impacting not just my players, but this entire community, and that we can play a huge role by engaging parents and giving them that really important education about responsible ownership that's just not easily accessible or obvious. The last thing I will say is that there is a challenge with guns being illegally sold. And so we do know that a percentage of guns on crime scenes, especially amongst our youth, are being purchased illegally. And there's things you can do about that as well. Putting pressure on your political leaders to think about, what are we doing with gun trafficking? It's not about who should own a gun and banning guns all the time. Sometimes it's about how do we disrupt these illegal markets that we know are operating. What are we doing about Glock switches that are being illegally sold and purchased in our communities, and these different devices that can make weapons more dangerous? And how are we looking at the gun shops or gun dealers that are acting irresponsibly? And are there any efforts to hold them accountable, and not just my 14-year-old who purchased it from their cousin, right? So thinking about those upstream efforts, which I think a lot of our law enforcement strategies are not versed on, is something that you can advocate for and make sure that your mayors, your city council, your governors are all looking at how do we disrupt the flow of guns and not just cracking down on the individual who owns it. And so hopefully that's a couple of helpful ways to think about how we can disrupt the flow of firearms.
Thank you, Greg. And thank you to this entire panel. The one note I'll put on with Greg is that it's not just about the education. We got to get people safe storage devices. We have to make people aware, and then we got to make these devices accessible. And I think, colleges in particular could be a really important player in how we can make more devices accessible. How do we kind of show and educate that they're really easy to use, and you still can have a firearm if you need it you believe you need it to keep you safe. And so I think that is a piece that we were working on, is how do we get more devices in more people's hands so that they could be safe and responsible in their home. But I was really grateful to moderate this conversation. I'm very grateful to Coach Smith, to Dr. Tillmon, to Arne, to Greg for sharing so much on the solutions. And now I'll turn it back to, I think, either Sam or Zach to see if there's any questions, but also bring us to wrap up. And I'm incredibly grateful to Play Smart and the work that you are doing to be part of the solution. Because as Arne said, there's no cavalry coming. The only solution to this problem is us. And so just incredibly grateful for your leadership and for your vision and how we can expand this work. And I'll turn it back to you, Sam, or Zach, if he's on.
Yeah, definitely. I know there's one more question in the chat too that maybe any of the panelists can chime in on, from Matt Elkin at Columbia. Is there evidence to show that exposing kids earlier to guns in a responsible way can help them later on in life, similar to drugs, sex, alcohol, any sort of education?
I mean, I think a bunch of us can speak to it. I mean, I was educated at a young age by my father around firearms, and but that what the evidence shows us is just being educated about firearms doesn't make you less irresponsible, I'll say, because you're young. And I still remember kind of finding his service revolver and pulling it out and messing around with it, and that was very irresponsible, even though I was trained in firearms. But I think that's what the evidence kind of tells us is it's really on the parents and the gun owners and the adult to take steps to make sure that guns are accessible to youth and not just relying on children to do the right thing. And I don't know if there's any other panelists who want to speak to that issue about that role of education for like younger children around firearms.
Yeah, I'll just dive in quickly. I mean, I think the education is critical. I don't know if you have to necessarily put a firearm in a young person's hand, but they do need to understand the risks. Same thing with drug use and anything else that could be dangerous, right? They need to understand the risks. They need to understand how to stay away from it. When is appropriate to use it, when is not. And frankly, if you do want to use it, here's how you use it and why. And I think if they can get just that baseline education, that'll reduce the likelihood of some of these younger incidents, especially accidental shootings and some of the school shootings. But I think, we have to shift behavior, but then we also have to make sure that, we are, for those who make that decision, they're being as responsible as possible. And a lot of that does live with the parents. So, I mean, a better investment might be just focusing on the parents and their responsible storage. And then with youth, really focusing more on behavior and how they're dealing with crisis or conflict. But I'll open it up to others.
I want to say something. I thought about the quote, "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure." And I think really helping educating people on the harm, what can happen if you really use a firearm. Because I think, in particularly at a young age, when we visit individuals or have conversations with individuals who utilize firearms, they not totally understanding that this is something permanent you're doing. And I think just being able to understand, like, when I pull this trigger, if it hits an individual, there's going to be a lasting effect. This situation doesn't go away. And also there's consequences tied to it. Like this is not just a situation where it's over with after that. And I think that it's almost something we use, and Arne could chime in around restorative practices, where an individual begins to understand the harm they cause when they use a firearm. But now we would be showing them on the front end, prior to using the firearm, the potential harm that could be caused, and helping them understand the trauma that's going to be impacted not only by the individual, but they're not thinking like you harming their family, their loved ones, and the entire community by using a firearm in a negative way.
Yeah, certainly great insight. And then one more question just in regards to de-escalation. I know Coach Smith talked about, wanting your student athletes to be, play with emotion, but not be emotional. And I even think now in the, political realm of our world where there's protests, some start peaceful, then they become not peaceful, and so talk a little bit about that. Any of you, Coach Smith, I think in particular, just in regards to, de-escalation.
Well, again, I think you have to equip, just like you would train them how to get back on defense, and the best offense is a good defense. So I think, and vice versa, the best defense is a good offense. So but you want them to appreciate the outcomes. Or as I said, the lasting, especially when it comes to violence. Because once that escalates to a point where you become physical, and that's the other thing is, as the old saying about sticks and stones may break my bones, and words will never hurt me. But you still have to be aware that words do, what come out of your mouth, and is really what leads to a lot. So I'll go back to respecting people. Again, that's what you're trained to do. Respect your opponent, and your opponent, or that adversary, that person you're having a disagreement with, whether it's in the home, on the street, or on the basketball court with your teammate, or even with the opposing. You've got to have some type of mechanism that you have to train players how to walk away. And so I don't know if I'm correct, but I think the education part is critical. I was going back listening to Dr. Tillmon talk. It's I don't think you need to put a gun in the person's hands. I was very fortunate to have parents, a father who understood what, and taught you the difference in what a weapon could do. And so these handguns, I grew up with shotguns, rifles, but just like I remember sneaking the pistol just to shoot at birds or something. But it's so now, again, maybe more training, just like we do video watching, scouting report. I think you need to do some of that to train kids so they understand the dangers and the fear. And it's important to know that, hey, there's a gun in this crowd. Let me get out of this environment. I don't know if I answered the question or not, but or whether I helped. But I think as coaches, it's important that you have these conversations with your athletes and everyone that surrounds your program, just like you would talk about a dress code, or you have rules and regulations, and they need to be implemented. That we're not going to allow guns, or we're not going to tolerate this type, and we're not going to have this in our program. So, and I think, the understanding that, and because I've had players where I've had to go take a gun from them, or that I've heard they had one. So now how do you've got to go right away and really address those issues immediately.
Thanks, Coach. I know we're at time here, so I'll pass it over to Ron Cottrell. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is Ron Cottrell. I'm the executive director of Play Smart, and I do have one other question I saw in the chat here that I think is really important from Miles Smith about not just coaches, but all those within the athletic department, whether it be a trainer or athletic director or sports psychologist or whatever. We need to surround these athletes with people who are not just caring about them, but also know how to sit down and visit with them and get in their world and what they've had to deal with throughout their lives. It's not just on us as coaches. It's certainly we're the point of the spear in a lot of ways as far as the connection with them. But there are so many people in the athletic department who need to be involved in this discussion with our athletes about how to de-escalate, how to deal with conflict, how to resolve situations, but also the whole safety issue. One of the questions that came up in my mind in all this is, it's great to talk about de-escalation and all that, and that's important. But if the gun is stored safely in the first place, much like Rob and Greg spent a lot of time working on this, but how do you talk to your teammate? How do you talk to your mom and dad? Those are tough discussions to have when you've moved away and you're living in an apartment and you've got a teammate that has a gun and it's not yours. How do you tell them, look, we need to be safe about what we're doing? Or how do you have a discussion with your mom and dad at home when you go home during the summer? Hey, mom or dad, we've got younger siblings or someone who may be compromised who we need to store our guns safely to keep them out of harm. And so those are really tough decisions that we as coaches need to have those discussions with our players about how to have those tough discussions. It's a multifaceted issue. Obviously, guns are so prevalent in our American society, and violence and social media has put us in a position where people resolve issues with guns. Unfortunately, as Chico talked about, I mean, if you feel disrespected, used to in the old days, you would fight it out in the playground, and a week later or 2 weeks later, you'd be best friends. Well, now they go to the worst possible scenario right off the bat, and it changes not only the person who got shot, but the person who did the shooting's life forever. And so it's certainly a multifaceted and difficult topic that we as Americans are having to deal with. This whole organization for us, for Play Smart, was born out of the death of Darius Lee 3 years ago this month. One of my players who lived in Harlem and was home for summer break and went to a Father's Day barbecue, and two rival gangs come through the barbecue in the park and were shooting at each other, and a few minutes later 8 people are shot and Darius is gone. And that's what started our organization, was our concern with how we see this happening over and over again, with young men and young women losing their lives due to gun violence. And so we as coaches don't have all the answers. We want to be part of the solution. We want to do everything we can to further this cause and do everything we can to try to bring these numbers down. I'm excited about the numbers that Rob and Greg talked about, how the numbers are coming down, and that's terrific news. And we want to continue to be a part of that as coaches. And coaches have such an important role in everything that we do in the sports world, and certainly with our student athletes. What a terrific discussion by our panelists. We couldn't ask for a better panel. I mean, it was a fantastic group to have, and we had great questions from you as attendees. We wanted to spend today, the Gun Violence Awareness Day, to bring awareness to the prevalence of gun violence in America, and what we can do as coaches, as part of Play Smart Save Lives, to be able to educate and help you as coaches deal with this issue. We want you to know that Play Smart and our board are here to help you talk to your teams. We're more than welcome to come and visit with you and your teams, your staffs. I've done quite a bit of that this last year, and just talking to them about being safe with their guns and being in situations where they take themselves away from violent situations. And then when you do have something happen on your campus or in your team, or what a family member of one of your teammates, we want to be there to help you. We want to help you have the resources you need to be able to get counseling to help the team through those situations. Having gone through that and trying to figure it out, it's not an easy thing to do. And we as coaches aren't always equipped to handle those situations. We want you to know that we may not have all the answers as coaches, but we can get you to the right places, and we're here to help you in any way we can through Play Smart and our board. We'd encourage you to go out and talk to your friends about our organization and getting involved with our organization. Follow us on Instagram, on Twitter, go to our website. We're going to have more webinars coming up and a lot of other projects that we're working on to get out into the community. And we want to be an active member of this solution as you're, side by side with you, working towards this. Again, I want to thank everyone for being here today. What a terrific panel, a terrific discussion. Also want to thank University of Chicago Crime Lab and Chicago Cred for partnering with us to make this happen. And I want to wish you all the best. Hope you have a great summer and everyone stays safe. Thank you again for everybody for joining in.
Thank you.